Okay, I'm going to go back to this because we're going to finish up the Scrum framework simplified version this morning. That's my goal. Anyway, my intention, we'll see if that works. 3 roles plus stakeholders. People are interested in what we do. Gone through this before. People have ideas. We put them on a backlog. We refine that backlog in terms of the overall backlog. We get it in sequence. That's the main thing. I call that backlog refinement as opposed to story refinement. We covered that basically, the basics of that on day 2, for those who remember. Then we're going to do continual story refinement. We're going to say, hey, this is the order with which we're going to take the stuff. And then we're going to take the stuff at the top and we're going to have some more detailed discussions about that. We're going to call that story refinement. That's the last thing I'm going to talk about, by the way. Then we're going to say, hey, here's the stuff at the top. Here's the stuff we know. Let's plan what we can fit into the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever the sprint length is. We're going to put it into a smaller backlog. We're going to call that the sprint backlog, right? Pretty simple stuff. Then we're going to start the sprint itself, which is the container for everything else. We're going to have a daily scrum where 15 minutes, we're going to do a true status meeting, which means we're going to talk about the status of the work, and we're going to do our best to move the work through the system by the end of the sprint. When we get to the end of the sprint, we're going to review the work with our stakeholders. We're going to review our processes and practices and things that we're doing as a team with each other in the retrospective. And Scrum Master is the glue that holds it all together and understands all this stuff, which is going to be you because you understand a lot of it already. So you're the glue. You're the servant leader. All right. So when we last left our hero, he was talking, not me, just theoretical hero, talking or getting started about sprint planning, because we've talked about all of that stuff except for 2 things. So I'm not just going to check off the stuff you remember. We haven't talked about story refinement much. We haven't talked much about sprint planning. We're going to talk about sprint planning next. Sprint planning is pretty simple in the sense that all we are trying to do is come up with a body of work from our product backlog that we can complete in 2 weeks or whatever the sprint length is. I'm just going to keep saying 2 weeks because I'm sorry, like every team I've worked with the last 5 years have been 2 weeks for sprints, right? So if I say that, you know it's sprint length. So sprint planning, what fits into 2 weeks? Now there's a couple ways really to determine what can fit into 2 weeks, because you have a backlog like this. These are my stories. They've all been vetted, right, during story refinement. And all we're going to do is we're going to pick from the top of the list. Now, the first way is the easy way, but I'm not saying it's the best way. It's good for a team that understands and is more mature. And this is what my team, both of my teams do now, by the way. I'm not saying that they have absolutely have reached that level of maturity, but that's what they, when you start out as a Scrum Master, you don't always get to start from scratch. Much easier to start from scratch, by the way, right? They were already doing something as far as sprint planning and getting them, once you have a team doing something, this is my editorial comment. Once a team is doing something, it's much, much harder to get them to change into doing something that you think is ideal, right? Because they have to make that decision. You don't get to make the decision as a Scrum Master and say, we're going to do things my way or the highway. That's not the way it works. So you have to lead them and move them if there's things that you think that they could do better. That usually takes more time. You with me on this? Right? To lead them where you want them to go. So anyway, here's the easy. I got an echo right there real quick. This is what I would do. I would basically say, here is the first story on our list. And I would ask the team, is it still I would ask the team, which includes my product owner, is this still really important thing that should we do it in the next 2 weeks? Because the answer may be no. Second question I'm going to ask them is, can we do it? We may have broken it down. We may have all kinds of information about it, but for whatever reason, we can't do it. Maybe there's some kind of dependency. Maybe we're waiting on somebody to do something. If the answer to both of those is yes, I'm going to move it in here. Now I'm going to go to the next one. Excuse me. I got a little bit of sniffles this morning. Next one, same question. Do we still want to do it? Can we do it? Move it in. And on and on and on until we get a bunch of stories in here. And then we're going to keep going basically till we can't fill it up anymore. And we're going to ask them, okay, is this a reasonable plan? Are we missing anything that we should be doing? Should we kick anything out? Are we trying to take too much? I liken it to a buffet. I would rather take less on my plate and then go back for a second trip than to take too much on my plate. You with me? And that's what I'll say to them, just like the buffet. Now, one of the ways that we're going to know how much we can take is that a mature team, if you remember this before, we plotted something called velocity, which is the movement of work through the system. Velocity is really just the movement of anything through a system over time. And we know that each sprint in the past, they had a certain velocity. If you remember something that looked like this, right? This is probably their velocity. Whatever this number is, let's say it could be stories. We do 10 stories plus or minus 2 per sprint, or you can go into the detail because you should have effort on everything, relative effort, right? We call that story points. You could say we move 20 story points, SP, story points, plus or minus 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever that number is, right? So when I'm planning this bucket, this thing when I'm pulling things off the backlog and putting it in the sprint backlog, what I want to do is I want to say, okay, are we about 10 stories or 20 story points? If they put 40 story points in there, what do you think I'm going to say as a Scrum Master? Right? Your eyes are too big for your stomach. Isn't that what we say? When you get too much of the buffet and you can't eat it all? Right? And that's what I'm going to go through. And then one other thing that we would do normally during this is, because I'm working with the team, and this is actually, I'm trying to tell you as close as possible to what we're currently doing with the 2 teams I work with, is once we have that sprint plan, we're going to take a look at it. We're going to prune it. We're going to say, we want to get some more in there. Is there something that needs to come out of there? Like if we put 40 points in there, maybe we need to take 20 points out. What can come out? Right? And you're going to do that. It's kind of a horse trading type of exercise. And then normally we say on a scale from 1 to 5, because we're on Zoom now, type it in the chat. How confident are you about this plan? Because the goal of the sprint plan is to take as much as you can take and nothing more. So that by the end of that, your goal, it's kind of like in class. You all went to school, right? When you take a test, what's your goal? Your goal is to get every question right, 100%, right? You with me? You don't go in there and you say, I'll take 90 to 100. We'll call that excellent. But you're not going to try to miss questions on purpose, are you? Of course not. That would be ludicrous. You're going to try to answer each and every question correctly, so you're going to go for 100%. That's what we're trying with a sprint plan. As we're saying, look, we've got these 10 stories. It's represented by 20 points, whatever. We believe with a certain level of conviction or confidence that we can complete every single thing on that backlog in the 2-week time or whatever your sprint like this, right? And I'll say 1 to 5. And they'll put if they put a bunch of 1s and 2s or 3s, I'm going to say, hey, there's something wrong with this plan. We need to kick something out, right? Something doesn't belong in here. If I get all 5s, I might question, maybe we want to look at maybe putting some more in, don't know. Maybe not. But I want to look for 4s and 5s, basically. You with me? That's the easier way to plan, not necessarily the best. Because what I'm assuming that the team has gone through this storming, norming, performing thing, right? And they're at a point where there's going to be some fluctuation, but it's not great, right? They have a velocity, and we got a pretty good idea of what they can take. Mature teams do that, right? And this is the one number I look for as a coach, not as a Scrum Master. I mean, I look at it as a Scrum Master, but as a coach, when it's time for me to stop coaching a team, is when they become what I would consider predictable in their ability to plan. Meaning that if they plan, and the number I'm looking for is 90% or greater, right? Just like when you're in school. When well, maybe some of us, when us old folks were at school, things were tougher. We all tell you that, you young people. It was like 93 or 94 to 100 was an A. Now it's all usually 90 to 100 is an A. But that's okay, right? 90 to 100 is an A, 80 to 90 is a B, right? Something like that. And what are we measuring? We're measuring the delivered or completed or accepted. I like accepted, maybe not delivered, maybe accepted is better. Accepted over the plan. What is that a measure of? It's a measure of how well we planned. If we get good at planning, what does that mean about our predictability? That means we're fairly predictable, right? Does that make sense? And that is a sign of a mature team, because a mature team can start using the backlog with this predictability, as we showed you on day 2, and they can start saying, this is what the future might look like. And that's very powerful. Not this is what the future is. That's waterfall. This is what the future might look like. What do you want to do about it? Right? Because that allows us to make changes. That allows us to do contingencies. That allows us to make decisions. And that's where the real value to the business is, right? So you with me? That's the easy way. But that's usually only with teams that are mature. If your team is not mature, the way you tell if they're mature is you measure this number. I tell them I'll do headstands in the corner if you can give me 90% or greater of what you planned every sprint, right? And you can't cheat. This is without overtime and stuff, right? Because the goal is not to work people to death. The goal is to get value through the system. And honestly, the working people to death and feeling like you've taken advantage of people, I've had managers say that they think they're getting more out of their people because their people are working longer hours. It's not true. You're just creating, we'll talk about it a little bit later, you're just creating more technical debt for the future. That's all you're doing. Because the studies show that usually beyond about 30 to 35 hours a week, which is less than most people work, you're actually, in most knowledge work, you're injecting more defects into the product than you are actually being productive. It's counterproductive to work more. If you're digging ditches, and I can get you to dig ditches for 50 hours a week versus 40 hours a week, I'm probably going to get about 20% more or 25% more. If you're a knowledge worker and I push you, I'm going to get less. I'm just not going to see it till later. It's going to show up later. It's going to show up when I need it, right? In PG&E, it'll show up during wildfire season or some kind of stress on the system is when you're going to find out all the things that you did, all the mistakes that you made by trying to work too hard. You don't want to work harder. You want to work smarter. We all know that, right? That's what people tell us anyway. Give me 1 second. Let me clear this board. So that's one way to do it. The second way to do sprint planning is capacity planning. This is what I usually do for teams that aren't as mature and for teams that aren't getting to that 90% or greater. Because there's something going on that we need to make sure that they're doing a better job of estimating. I keep seeing all this stuff on LinkedIn. I think there's this thing in the agile coaching and agile community of no estimates, and it's gaining a lot of steam. I still don't agree with it because I think we still need estimates. I think we can get better at estimates. And I think that's what we need to do. I think saying, well, we're just terrible at estimates. We can't know anything about the future. Therefore, we're going to throw up our hands and just, do nothing. Don't agree with. Doesn't make sense to me. Can you be successful doing it? Yeah, you might sell some software. You might stay in business. Will you be optimal? I don't think so. Anyway, capacity planning. Here's how capacity planning works. You have a certain number of developers on your team who are going to be contributing to that sprint. We're going to verify that what they're going to take fits. So we're going to go into detail. So the detail will be something that a lot of people also don't like, is we're going to break things down into tasks and hours. And we're going to do that during story refinement. So I didn't say a lot about story refinement. I'm not going to go into detail just yet. I'm going to go into a bunch of detail in a second, but story refinement for me is this. You have a backlog with a story, And there's a bunch of them. I'm going to give myself some space, right? And then I get into refinement. I'm going to do two things in refinement primarily, if they're going to do, especially if they're going to break things down into tasks and hours. I'm going to, three things. I'm going to do the narrative of the story. The narrative is usually as, I'm going to explain this later. I want, so that, I'm not going to explain it yet. I'm just going to tell you. Some of you are familiar with that. As a user of banking systems, I want to be able to remove my money via ATM machine so that I don't have to wait in line in a bank. Not the best written story, but you get the idea. I refer to that as the narrative because I don't know what anybody else has called it before, and nobody's told me yet. And I've been looking around, so somebody gives me a better word, but I'll call it the narrative. Second thing I'm going to look for is acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria in a way is kind of like a test. And if this is a foreign concept to you, then it shouldn't be. It's some of you might do use cases, but it doesn't matter. It's how do I know I've done the work that you've required of me, right? So if I'm doing an ATM machine, well, the ATM, you put your card in, you type in your 4-digit code. If it's correct, you type in how much money you want, and then it dispenses the money and it debits the account and blah, blah, blah. That's acceptance criteria. That's particular to that work. You with me? That's particular to that story. I'm going to use the word story, but it's still just a product backlog item. It's something we want to do. The third thing I'm going to do is I'm going to break it down into tasks and hours, potentially. This is optional. But if I'm going to do capacity planning, I'm going to do this. Because the purpose of sprint planning story refinement is to gain a shared understanding of what we're going to do in the future. You with me? I know this well enough that I can plan it and I can execute it in the next sprint. So that's why I want to have a narrative which explains to me what the story is. I want to have acceptance criteria which tell me this is what you need to do to make sure that you've done what this story requires. And then if we're going to break things down, we may break them down into tasks and hours. So again, I'm going to use the ATM machine example. There's going to be certain things I'm going to need to do in order to do that ATM example, right? And we'll call those tasks. These are things that an individual will have to do in order to be successful. There's one other thing I need to introduce here, which is DOD, definition of done. It's in the Scrum guide. What is the definition of done? The definition of done is the criteria that is common to all the work in the backlog in order for the work to be considered complete. Okay? So you can think about acceptance criteria for a story as something that's particular to the story. The definition of done is the AC for everything. It's like a shorthand. It's your acceptance criteria for everything. It's common to all the work. What are some examples of definition of done? Well, there's going to be environment. The ultimate definition of done is I've finished the work in 2 weeks and or even in 3 days or sometime during the sprint, I've actually delivered it to my customer by the end of the sprint. Then it's done. Most places, how many places can do that? Not most places, especially if you're coming out of waterfall, especially your new team. You're going to have some idea of what environment is. I'm going to talk particularly about software development because it's what I know. You're going to have different things for whatever you do if it's not software development. I'm going to have an environment. I might be able to get it into what they call, after acceptance criteria, I can't think of it now, UAT. I might be able to get it to user acceptance testing. So there may be like a UAT machine or environment. That could be my definition of done, right? I can't get it all the way to my customer in production, but I can get it to them in a user acceptance testing environment. If that's reasonable, then that should be part of your definition of done. If that's not reasonable, it may be that you can only get it into QA. environment. You can't get it all the way down, but right now it's QA environment. Hopefully it's QA environment at the least. But there's going to be some notion of quality and some notion of where the product is. And then we're talking about code. So what are the quality things? You may have different severities of defects, meaning that this defect is really bad. The whole machine's going to catch on fire, and then you might have it as low as this is really not convenient for the customer, but we can accept it because they're just different severities, right? So you might want to say there's no severity 1 defects in your work. You might want to make sure that your work is reviewed. So you might have code review as part of your definition of done. You're going to have a whole bunch of different things in there. You might want to have something about testing, automated testing, like all automated tests are written. The reason I'm going through this stuff on definition of done, and you can all look up different examples of it, is these are the things that are common to all the work before it is considered done. And you're going to have a listing of them. The other thing I want to say about the definition of done, and this is what most organizations do, and I believe I call this the PMO mentality, and I apologize to folks who are PMO fans. The PMO mentality is, let's make one rule for everyone. It's not going to work. You're going to have different definitions of done based on the teams and the backlog that you're working. Because different teams in different parts of the organization are going to be able to do different things. Because the ultimate definition of done is I have a high quality product that's in my customer's hands. It's not always going to be reasonable. And if you create a definition of done that the team can't do, that's problematic, okay? Why did I say that? Well, the definition of done is going to inform to some degree the tasks that you need to do. Makes sense, right? If I need to make sure that automated tests are written, when I start writing my tasks, I'm going to have a task that says create automated tests. And if I'm writing code, I might have to have something that says write the code. And if I'm going to do QA, I might need to create QA tests plan, right? I might need to execute the QA test plan. You with me? These are just things that I would need to do. If I'm doing code review, I might have to have a task that says do code review. What are the things that this story needs in order to be done? That's why I had to go into the definition of done, because the definition of done is going to inform those tasks. Let me get some room here. So from my definition of done, I know I need to write some code. I know I need to create automated tests. I know I need to create a QA plan. I need to execute that plan. I'm going to do some code review. And I'm going to put this twice because I'm going to have 2 people doing it. Tasks go to the individual level. In addition to code review, I need to get this to a UAT machine. So maybe there's some deployment activities that I need to do. You with me? These are all tasks that I need to do in order to make sure that whatever story I've got is done. And then the AC is particular to the story. That's how I accept it, right? The product owner is going to make sure that this acceptance criteria is done, right? As well as the definition of done. So these might be the tasks under a story. And I'm going into this whole thing called capacity planning. And I'm going to ask the question then, and they should be able to, team should be able to do this, by the way. Shouldn't be that big a deal. Because if somebody tells me, when we get done doing the refinement, somebody tells me they have a shared understanding of the work, they should probably have some idea of what they need to do to do it, right? I'm not asking them to do the work. I'm saying, what are the things that you need to do in order to get this work done? So I'm going to ask them a few things. One, how many hours in a day? We talked about this, I think, before. How many productive hours in a day? Anybody know? You know what
5.
science tells us?
5.
Yeah, 5. Science tells me that 60% of your day is going to be productive. There's 8 hours in a day. That's 4.8 hours on the average. You're getting about 4.8 hours in an 8-hour day of actual productivity. What's the rest of the stuff? Yeah, I don't know. Meetings, who knows? Trust falls. Team building, I don't know. Right? So I always tell teams, hey, when I'm talking to teams, I say, you guys are a little bit better than average. We'll start with 5. 5 hours in a day. I want to keep that in mind. Because that's what we're going to use as our planning number. That's where we're going to start, by the way. So I got 5 hours, you got 5 hours in a day, each individual. When I'm going through the tasks, I usually ask them, if you're going to, if an average individual, average programmer, just put that in your head, right? Somebody who knows what they're doing is usually what I say. If somebody who knows what they're doing is going to write code for this particular story, how long is it going to take? And they don't think as well in hours as they do usually in days. I'll say, is it a half day, full day, day and a half, etc.? Are you with me? So they say, hey, it's going to take about a day and a half. I say, okay, 7 hours sound reasonable? Okay, good. 7 hours. That's an estimate, a true estimate, right? People don't, that's one of the reasons why people want to get rid of estimates is they don't know what estimate means. Estimate's an estimate. It's not a fact. You're going to create automated tests. It's going to take about half a day. So we're going to give them maybe 3 hours. Creating the QA plan, about 3 hours. Executing it only takes about an hour. Code review is about an hour a piece. You with me? I'm asking the team. Deployment usually takes 2 hours because we got a funky system. Who cares? They're going to give me some kind of estimate on what a normal individual can do. That's our first estimate. And then once we've done that for that story, right, we've done the acceptance criteria, the narrative, and in this case, the optional tasks and hours. That story is done in the sense of it is now refined. It's not done, it's refined. It is ready to plan. I messed myself up here and I put this in my spot, I was going to say. Now I got to erase stuff. You can't just cross it out or anything. Got to erase it. Okay, so sprint planning shows up. We've got a bunch of stories, right? We've done this with a bunch of stories. We've done it with the stuff that we think would probably fit. We've got acceptance criteria, we've got a narrative, we've got planning. I'll go into more detail on the refinement piece, but this is what I have going into planning. And I may have things broken down into tasks and hours. Now it's going to be real easy. Before we did tasks and hours, we just asked them a simple question. Does this story, do we want to do this? Does it fit? Yes, it's in. Okay, next story. Do we want to do it? Does it fit? Yes, it's in, right? When we do capacity planning, we're actually going to make sure that things fit in terms of hours. This is a technique. I'm not saying you have to do it. If you can, with a team that's not performing well and not planning well, this is a good exercise for them because they're going to learn things that they didn't know before. So capacity planning, I'm going to go and I'm going to say, Ely, we've got a sprint that's 2 weeks, 10 days, and you can give me 5 hours a day if you're fully engaged in what we're doing.
Yes.
Yes. And how many hours are you going to be able to give me over the next 2 weeks? You're going to say, well, Larry, I'm going to take a couple days off. I'm going to take 2 days off. So I can give you 40 hours. Oops, I'm still erasing. Doesn't work that way. Ely, 40 hours. Right? I go to Jamal. Yeah. Jamal, how many hours can you give me? He said, well, I've got training all next week. I give you 25 hours. I go to Fedor. I'm just reading the names as I see them on my screen. Fedor says, hey, I work all the time. These guys are slackers. I can give you 50 hours. Right? And then maybe Griffin, I'm going to ask, how many hours can you give me, Griffin? Griffin says, I'm working on 5 other projects. I can give you 10 hours. So Griffin, why the heck are you working on 5 other projects? We need to fix that. Anyway, I'm going to get an estimate. All this is if you understand science, which I think you do, this is a hypothesis. All of these are just hypotheses. They're our best guess. Do I really know if Griffin's going to give me 10 hours? I have no idea if Griffin's going to give me 10 hours. I'll get to you in a second, Maria. If I don't answer it, keep your hand up. When we get into the planning, what we're going to do is we're going to say, here is the first story we want to plan. Here's the tasks and hours we thought that it would take somebody. I'm going to say, who wants to write code, right? Be the developer, basically, the software developer for this story. And Fedor says, man, I really want to do this. Okay, Fedor, you can have it. Fedor, we thought that the average person would take about 7 hours to do this. How long do you think it's going to take you?
30 minutes.
He's going to say 30 minutes. He's going to say, no, I haven't done it before. It's going to take me more, I think maybe 9 hours. Maybe it'll take me a little longer. Okay. And now Fedor has 41 hours left of his capacity. Create the automated test. Well, that should be done by the person who's writing the code, if you don't know that, but that's okay. 3 hours, Fedor? Yeah, that sounds about right. QA plan. Oh, shouldn't be done by the person who's writing it. Ely says, I'll do that. It'll take me 3 hours, it's fine. Execute it. Last time I had a problem executed, it'd take me 2 hours. Usually the same person. Code review. I'll help out with that, Griffin says. The other person in the code review is Fedor because he wrote the code. You see what I'm doing. Why am I doing this? This is a crazy thing. Because sometimes things look like they fit, but they don't fit. Sometimes this is the reason for doing the tasks and hours capacity planning, which every team is probably going to push back on, which is fine. Let them push back on it. I still want them to understand, because what happens is, I think Fedor was about right, because Fedor says it's going to take him a half hour, right? Because I think we're all optimists when we plan. And what this confirms for me, and the reason that I've gone through it, and I would say that probably it's less and less these days. And I don't want to say it's because of the younger generation, because we've got enough to blame on them. It's probably true. But anyway, I do it less and less these days. I used to do it probably with 9 out of 10 of my teams. I do it probably with about 6 out of 10 now. But I do it for a reason. Right? So once we finish this story, then this story is done. Guess what? We're going to go to the next story. We're going to do the same thing. There's a couple things that I want to get you to understand during the sprint planning. I have not dictated anything. No one has dictated anything. It has been, in both cases, the team accepting the work. And the one, they're accepting it in total, story by story. And the second one, we're just breaking it down into smaller pieces, and people are signing up for particular things ahead of time. And that doesn't mean that they're the ones who are going to end up doing it too. It just means that we're trying to go to great lengths to show what can actually fit into the sprint. Right? I used to spend a lot more time on it. I'm going to spend less than I normally do. Break it down, figure out people's actual capacity, see what fits, and verify it. Because this exercise, there's value in the exercise. There's not as much value in the plan unless the plan actually ends up being better as a result. But what they're going to do is they're going to learn things they didn't know before. I'll give you an example of where this helped in the quote unquote real world. I mean, we all live in the real world, I would assume, or whatever. I worked with a team, and I might have mentioned this before. I worked with a team that was not getting as much through the system as management expected. Not an unusual situation. You're not developing software as quickly or as much as we would like you to. And so what did they do? Well, they did what most management folks do, unfortunately, is they didn't really think through the thing too much. And they said, let's just hire more developers because developers develop software. And in a way that makes a little bit of sense. But what they didn't do is they didn't realize what the problem was. And when we went and started breaking things down into capacity planning, what we found out is they didn't need developers. They needed people who could do the QA because they didn't have enough capacity for QA. And this was a team that fought me because I kept hearing the same thing. We're not getting enough. We're not getting enough. Our plans weren't good, and I'm wondering what's going on. And it took me probably months to convince them, let's just try this exercise of breaking things down into tasks and hours, and then do capacity planning and see where the problem is. Well, the problem is they didn't have enough QA people. So you cannot complete a work if it's not QA'd. So they could have hired 1,000 developers. It wouldn't have mattered. We'll talk about this when we get to theory constraints. They didn't have enough QA. And the developers, you can tell they had a little bit of attitude problem because they didn't want to play this game with me. And they did have a little bit of attitude. Good people, but a little attitude problem. We all do from time to time. They didn't want to QA stuff. They just wanted to develop. It doesn't do them any good. You don't get it through the system, right? So there are reasons to go to this length. Basically breaking down each story. But again, I had to talk about a lot of things before I got there because you got to understand your definition of done and you need to create one regardless of how you plan. But your tasks and hours should reflect to a certain degree the things that you need to do, which is your definition of done. So I got to sneak that in on you, right? Make sense? And then you continue to go story by story until you run out of capacity over here. And then you're done. I guarantee you that you won't get a lot of teams these days to do it. But I can also guarantee you if you go to this length, they will A, understand the work better, and B, they will plan better. That's almost a guaranteed. But if they can do 90% or greater, I don't care how they do it. They want to do it by stories, do it by story. As long as they're successful, right? Because one of the things we have to be very careful of always is we got to concentrate in order to be optimal. We need to concentrate on outputs and outcomes as opposed to inputs. So capacity planning, what I showed you here, used to be something that I don't know if they still do it in this. Did they do this in the CSM training, folks who took the CSM with Sasha? They don't do it anymore. It used to be a big part of the CSM training when I took it. I took it like 10 years ago or something. It used to be a big part. I don't even think they teach it anymore. Because you have to focus on the outputs and the outcomes. What's the output I'm looking for? The output I'm looking for is, are you planning effectively? What does it mean to plan effectively? Well, you plan 10 stories, you finish 9 or 10. You plan 20 points, you deliver, 18 to 20. Pretty effective planning, right? So I don't need to go to this level, but if I'm not effective planning, I might need to go to this level. So that's sprint planning. Those are the two ways you can do it. Okay? You with me? You still with me? You're always with me. I want to talk about refinement. Remember I talked about refinement. In refinement, there are 3 things. The narrative, the acceptance criteria, and then if we break things down into tasks and hours. So I already explained the tasks and hours bit. I'm going to talk a lot now about how do we get to the narrative, and most importantly, that acceptance criteria. That's really the crux of the work that we do. And with my teams, what I try to do, and I'm sometimes successful, is we're going to use a technique called behavior-driven development. And so I've got a presentation on behavior-driven development. Isn't that exciting for y'all? Larry, I want nothing more than to have a presentation on behavior-driven development. Thank you so much for reading my mind this morning. Sometimes coaches are known for certain things. Norm Kurth, he's known for retrospectives. There's others. I can't think of any other examples. If I were known for one thing, it would probably be this class. If I was known for something else, it would be BDD. I'm a big proponent of something called behavior-driven development. Now, for those of you who are not in development, this still makes sense, because what we're really, the bigger picture here is, how do we build quality into our products? Because unfortunately, most people think that you can inspect quality into a product. You know what inspection is, right? Inspection is something we do after we've created the product. We create something and we see, is this to our specification, right? So we get out our calipers and whatever, and we measure and make sure that it, and if it doesn't match our expectations, what do? We got to throw it out. If you're in manufacturing, you throw it out. You can't keep it. And you know that there's something wrong with the system that's creating it, and you need to fix something in the system. So even inspection tells us that you cannot inspect quality into a product. You can only build quality into a product. Now, that's very tough for people, even in software development. I want you to wrap your head around it because it's really important. This guy here is a guy called W. Edward Deming. Some of you might be familiar. So you've taken your business courses, you ran into some guy named Deming. That's that good-looking gentleman on the right. Quality comes not from inspection, but from improvement of the production process. He was a manufacturing guy, by the way, but we're going to apply some of his manufacturing ideas to software and knowledge work. You cannot rely on mass inspection to improve quality, because the quality is there or it is not by the time you get to the inspection. I know it seems simple for those of you who know it, but for those of you who haven't thought this way, that it's probably a different thing. You can only inject quality into a product. You cannot inspect quality into a product. And most of what we do in software development is inspection after the fact. We build something and then we look for defects. That is not how you create a quality product, because inspection is only one part of the quality, and it's a very small part of the quality. You got to build it in. So when I came across this thing called BDD, it resonated with me, and that's a great story too, because that was part of a retrospective. Most of the good things that have come to me in my life have come to me from the team. This was an individual who said at one of the retrospectives, because we were talking about quality of our software and how we can improve it, he says, we need to do BDD. And I said, what the heck is BDD? Just like you guys right now. I didn't understand it, but he made a good case for it, and the team started doing it, and they did it, and it was successful, but I still didn't understand it. I had to go back and do some reading and figuring out. It took me a while to understand it. So if you don't understand it right today, that's okay. It took me a while, but it's important, because when we talk about the 3 Ps of Agile, which is the philosophy, the processes, and the practices, this is one of the practices that's a good practice that helps us to stay agile. Behavior-driven development starts with something that came from before, which was called test-driven development. And this is another thing I had to wrap my head around a long time ago, and it was really tough for me. Normally, when we're learning how to develop software, they don't teach it optimally. I know, I have a son who went through it in college. I asked him a bunch of questions about how they taught it. It was not up to my satisfaction. But he has a job, so it was satisfying enough. They teach people how to write code. That's what they do. You pick up a book, they teach you how to write code. That's not enough. It's okay. It's good, but it's not where I would want to be. TDD turns things on its head. So you don't write code. Well, you do write code, but you don't write the code of what you want things to do. You write the test of how you want things to behave before you write any code at all. So the first step in TDD is you write what's called a unit test, because it's in a unit test framework, and then it fails. I've got nothing yet. I've just written a test. Then I'm going to write some code that make the test pass. And then I've got this other thing where I'm going to refactor. What does refactoring mean for those of you who don't write code? If you haven't written code, you have written the 5-paragraph essay. I know that because my son was a freshman in high school. He just finished this past week, right? Last week. And what did he have to write in English? He had to write a 5-paragraph essay. When you write a 5-paragraph essay, you write the 5-paragraph essay and then you hand it in, right? No, of course not. You write the 5-paragraph essay and then you edit it. You make sure that it makes sense. You make sure that it's coherent, right? You may combine some sentences, you may tear apart some sentences, whatever. That's refactoring in just, human readable English writing. We do something similar in code. So those who do code understand what I'm saying in code, and those who don't understand code, think about it as editing it, making it better, making it cleaner, making it clearer. And that's the TDD process. It comes to us from something called extreme programming and a gentleman named Kent Beck, which is a wonderful story for our programmers because the unit test framework that is in use today, if you hear Kent Beck tell the story, it was basically written between Kent Beck and another gentleman on a flight to Europe. They got on the plane, they started coding it. By the time the plane landed, they had basically a unit test framework that exists today. The bulk of it. It's a pretty interesting story. But this is a different way of thinking. Write the test first. What does that mean? That means I need to have my goal in mind before I do anything, which makes sense. And I need to be able to prove it before I do anything else. That's what writing the test first means. It's a little more complicated than that, but it's close enough. It's a different way of thinking, right? Because I was taught, I'm self-taught by reading books. When I taught myself to code and when I took my TRS 80 computer class back in junior high school, I was taught write code. I wasn't taught this. Why would we do TDD? Well, TDD actually creates much better code. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this. I've written this presentation. I still present it to a lot of developers. I'm not going to go into all the detail. I'm going to skip around some pieces. It makes my code much easier to maintain. Because here's the thing about code, right? It's not, this is where the analogy with a book goes. If you're writing a book, right? You write a book, you edit it, that's refactoring, blah, blah, blah. Eventually you print it. Once it's printed, it doesn't change. The beautiful thing, and also the curse of software development, is you can change it at any time. It's just code. I mean, and most things are in the cloud now, so we're changing it all the time. It's not like you're sending a CD out anymore. You're changing all the time. Code is very easy to change. It's very malleable. But the more code you write, the harder it is to change it, right? So those of you who are on the business side, you go to your software development people and you say, I just want to put a button on this screen and capture, some information, right? Simple stuff. It's simple at the beginning, but if there's a lot of code, it becomes harder and harder unless I write code so that it can be easily maintained, right? So you go to them, you think, oh, it'll take a day. And they'll be like, yeah, that'll take about 2 months, right? This is because this is what happens to code over time. And it's inevitable that the more code you have, the harder it is going to be able to maintain and extend and do all the things you need to do in the future. You get good code coverage when you do test-driven development, obviously, because you're writing a test for everything you write. You get cleaner interfaces. It's easier to refactor, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, you do TDD because it's higher quality. And I can talk, who's a developer? Raise your hand. I know I got some in here. No one? Rajesh. Rajesh, you've heard of test-driven development, right, Rajesh? He says yes. He didn't unmute, but I can see.
Oh,
there
yeah.
he is.
No, yes, yeah.
He's heard of it. And you know that this is a good thing to do, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I think most developers understand that. Do you usually do this, Rajesh? I'm not gonna put you on the spot.
The test coverage is the tricky, the code coverage is the tricky part.
Yeah. So I think, and I got some other people raise their hands. I'm assuming they're raising their hand because they're developers.
Yeah.
I think all developers know that this is higher quality. It's better. It's not easy to do, and we don't all do it. And I think the reason is because we haven't been taught. Because we're taught to write code. We're not taught to read code, and we're not taught to write tests, which we should be. So, if you're part of a university system, hire me. I'll teach them the right way. Just kidding. Asfandiar had his hand raised, and Raul had their hand raised because I'm assuming they're developers and they agree with me. It's not hard to get developers to agree with me on this. This is not something that is a fighting thing, right?
You're absolutely right. And actually it's built into some IDEs, it's built into the development environments to write unit codes. Now we don't do it, but it is there so that you do it.
Yeah, right. So this is good, because what you basically confirmed to me is what I think we all know, right? Is that it's the right thing to do, but we don't always do it, right? I'm going to talk a little bit about TDD. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. I'm looking at the time. It's 8:30. I got a little bit of time. Okay. So does anybody know who this is? This is Bob. This gentleman that's on your screen. His name is Bob Martin, Robert Martin. He's one of the original signatories of the Agile Manifesto. He's well known in computing circles. You might not have seen his picture. You probably know him as Uncle Bob. If you do, that's his nickname, Uncle Bob. I don't think it's the best nickname. Sounds kind of creepy, but anyway, he's a software development professional since 1970. And he's one of the world-renowned experts on something called clean code or good software development. He wrote a book called Clean Code, which is pretty famous. So when I give this presentation, I'm talking to developers. I'm talking to all of you today, but when I'm talking to developers, I say, you don't have to believe what I have to say. Let's go to an expert. You don't know who I am. I'm not an expert, but I'm smart enough to listen to him. He says, here's the problem with any type of writing. If you think about code like creative writing, you don't get it right the first time. You always have to edit it. You got to change it. You got to make things. Hey, you look at the software products you use every day. They're changing all the time, right? They don't stay the same. You can't just get it right the first time. That's what we do when we learn how to code, by the way, is we write these simple things from scratch. When you take a job as a software developer, what are the odds that you're going to write anything from scratch? Pretty close to zero. You're going to be working with code that already existed for some time. Hopefully it didn't exist for too long, because the longer it's existed, the worse it probably is and the harder it is to work with, right? Everything you do, if you do it with test-driven development, it's going to make it easier in the future, right? Pay me now, pay me later. That's what he's kind of saying in this quote. One of the things about test-driven development is if we write the tests well, they become documentation for the code that we're doing, right? Because the tests themselves explain what the code does. So he says, if you want to go fast, you need to do this. Because what will happen is over time, it will get slower and slower and slower and slower the more code that you write, especially if you don't write it so that it can be changed. That's the key. Because the world is constantly changing. If you write code that is not easy to change, you're in for a heap of trouble later on, because God knows you're going to have to change it at some point in time. But we don't teach people that way. Most of the time when you're a software developer, and this is what they should teach them on day one before they decide to go through with it, in my opinion, is you're going to spend the majority of your time reading code, not writing code. But that's what we teach you. We teach you how to write it. We should teach you how to read it, because that's what you're going to spend most of your time doing. And he says, well, the time that you spent reading is maybe 10 to 1. Trying to understand the code that someone else has written, not even yourself. But if I can tell you one thing, having written code, and my developers will agree with me, if you've written something and then you go look at it 3 months later, it's like somebody else had written it. You're not going to remember, right? So you're going to spend all your time reading code that someone else has written. So if you're going to be a good teammate, right? If you're not the only person who's going to write code, and even if you are, be good to yourself. Write code that other people can read, including your future self, right? Because that's the key. That's what this whole day is about, building quality into it. Well, what's quality? Quality in code is building code that people can read. This is the thing that drives me crazy about reading other people's code, there's no shortage of ego in computer programming. You all know that. People write the code to show how clever they are. I don't care. If you're writing code to show how clever you are, I can't read it because maybe I'm not that clever. Chances are I'm not. Write your code so other people can read it. And then I really dig in on this is what I present to the developers. I really dig on the developers. I say, look, if you think just getting code to work is what your job is, you're sorely mistaken here, right? Because what you create today is going to have to be changed in the future by you or probably somebody else. And the way you write your code today is going to have a profound effect on your business's ability to change the code and make money, right? Don't be clever. I always tell my developers, write your code as if the next person who is going to read it is a psychopath who has your home address. And then I dig into them even further. Programmers who satisfy themselves with merely working code are behaving unprofessionally. I didn't say it. He said it. Uncle Bob said it. The foremost authority on coding said, you're behaving unprofessionally. Why don't you behave professionally? Darn you. Writing clean code is what you must do in order to be professional. There's no reasonable excuse for doing anything less than your best. And there's a bunch of other things that a professional developer does. I'm not going to go into all these. I go into these with the developers. I tell them at this point in time, I've torn the curtain away. And you can curse me for the rest of your life because now that I've shown you what you need to do to be a professional, when you don't do it, you're not going to feel too good about it. It's pretty harsh. I'm a harsh person. So why don't we do it? Well, here's the reasons. And these are the ones that I think most of my developers will probably agree with. Most developers don't learn TDD. When they're learning to code, they learn to write it. They don't learn to read it and they don't learn to write tests. And that's a problem. Because they think that what they learned is everything that it is. It's not everything that there is. You're going to have to learn some other skills. It's very disciplined. Extremely disciplined. And I'm not going to say that we, not only do we have sometimes maybe ego problems in the software development world, but we also aren't the most disciplined folks, are we? Maybe your experience is different. Because developers, I love developers. Some of my favorite people, but they're the ones who took their toys apart when they were kids. They love, taking things apart. They love doing things. You got to slow down, really slow, because you're writing a little bit of a test and you're writing some code, and then you're writing a little more tests and then some more code. Very disciplined. Most developers aren't disciplined enough to do it. They have to learn the discipline. There's a perception by a lot of people that this is slower. Because now I am more disciplined, that approach is slower. It's not. It's only a perception. I was doing some of this work with a group. Well, I'm going to talk about that group later, so I'll hit this later because I've got a story about that. You're never going to get a chance to write code from scratch and do all the wonderful things that you want to do. Even if you do TDD, you're going to start working with somebody else's code, and they probably haven't done this. And because they haven't done this, it's going to make it more difficult for you to do it. That's legacy code, right? And most of us have to work with that. There's ways to do it, but it's harder. You have other things you need to learn in order to do test-driven development. These are skills you have to learn. Not all developers have them. I've found actually some of the younger folks are getting these skills taught to them, thankfully, which is you need to learn to mock objects. But here's the thing. Rajesh and Asfantiar, others, they said, hey, yeah, I know this TDD is a good thing, but I really don't do it that much. It's okay. Don't feel bad. I don't want you to feel bad. I'm not picking on you. You feel okay? Rajesh, you're okay? You're all right. Because we all come across this. This is something that Dan North, who discovered and invented BDD, he says, I kept coming across the same thing. I had all these developers who wanted to do TDD, but they just couldn't figure out how to do it because it's not like it's easy, right? So what he did is he said, instead of, why don't we concentrate on the behavior of the system and see if that helps us? That's always a simple question. Let's just concentrate on the behavior of the system. Let's see if this will help us with test-driven development. So his impetus, his reason for creating BDD was so that we could do test-driven development. That's important. Because BDD actually does more. So this is the thing. They started doing something called BDD. I'm gonna show you in a little bit. I don't know if I'll get to it today, but I'll show it to you next time. He created it in order to do test-driven development, but what they found was something very interesting. And this is what I found too, again and again, because it's rare. I mean, I have one team that's kind of doing it. I have another team that's not doing it. It's a different story. It's because, again, when you work with a team that's just already going, it's tougher to introduce things. But whenever I have a brand new team, we are taught this and we do this. Because what happens is, how many people have been in a situation where the business has asked you to do something? And I'm talking specifically about software, but I'm sure it's about anything in business. I just know software. I don't know much of anything else, to be honest with you. They ask you to do something, you do it, you show it to them, and they say, that's not what I wanted. Right? Happens all the time. Happens all the time. And the reason it does is we're not communicating very well. I worked at one place, when I give you the example, they used to call it dolphin speak. The business used to joke about it. Because when the business would talk with developers, what they would hear is kind of like Charlie Brown's classroom. You remember Charlie Brown? They used to have the animated Charlie Brown, and the parents would talk wah 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 wah, because parents never got to talk in Charlie Brown. Well, that's what the business felt about the developers. I apologize to my developer friends here. They called it dolphin speak where I was. It's wah, 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 wah. They don't understand what you're saying. If you're going to build a good product, the people who are building the product and the people who want the product, you better understand each other. You with me? And that happened all the time because they couldn't understand each other. And it's probably the same with the developers, right? They didn't understand the business. They're just not as mean as the business people. They didn't call it dolphin speak. But regardless, if you cannot come to a shared understanding of what it is that you're going to build, how in the world are you going to build it? This is what the refinement process is all about, is let's come to a shared understanding of what it is that you want me to do so that I have a better chance of actually getting it right. Because there's no guarantee you're going to get it right. Because the other thing with business people, and I love them too, but business people, sometimes they don't know it till they see it. So you put something together and you have to show it to them, and then they'll say, that's not what I wanted, but here's what I want. And that's not bad either. But in the end, you're going to be much better. You're going to be optimal if you can try to get it right more often the first time around. So the conversations of BDD were what really changed the equation, because now what happens is the business and developers are speaking a shared language, which is the behavior of the system. And once we speak a shared language, the odds of us getting it right are much, much better. So not only does BDD allow us to do TDD, which is very important, but more important, it allows us to actually get it right. Because in order to be effective, we need to do the right things and we need to do them the right way. So TDD does it the right way. It is a process in some respects, though there can be some argument, there's overlap. BDD makes sure we're building the right thing so that we're not dolphin speaking to each other. There's no silver bullet in software development. BDD is as close as it gets in my book. I've not found anything that works as well. That's why any new team I have, this is kind of a prerequisite. Just like they have to go through my training. In an ideal world, I don't always get to choose. Sometimes, more often now, I get to choose. They got to go through my training. They have to invest 10 hours to start. they have to do BDD because that's how successful it is. I wrote a blog about the 10 reasons why BDD changes everything. It's been almost 10 years. It's still probably the #1 blog post out of the hundreds I've written over the years. So it's not the only reason. I mean, people are interested in it. We'll get through the 10 reasons in the beginning. Again, it's all about building quality into the product that you're building. So I don't care what product you're building, take the ideas and concepts and abstract them and try to apply them as best you can to what you're doing. I'm just giving an example of how you can do it with software development. You may have to have other things, whatever you're doing out there, if it's not software development, where you have to figure out and ask the question, how do I make sure I am building quality into my product and not trying to inspect it after the fact? Okay, so the example I'm going to give you happens to be from software. That's where I live. That's where I work. That's what I know.